August 6, 1945. Hiroshima, Japan. The first light of morning spills across the Oda River, touching tiled rooftops, tram lines, and rows of bicycles leaning against wooden fences. The cicadas are already loud. Streetcars rattle over the bridge as schoolgirls in white blouses make their way toward class. The air smells of rain that never came above the clouds. Nearly 6 miles higher, a silver aircraft slices through the pale sky. A Boeing B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay. Inside, 12 men in oxygen masks check their instruments. In silence below them lies a city that has never truly known the weight of war. Hiroshima's air raid. Sirens have grown careless after months of peace, believing the Americans no longer care for a city spared from previous bombings. At 08:15 a.m., the calm of an ordinary morning prepares to fracture into history. A single bomb cradled in the bay of the aircraft will alter the world in less than a heartbeat. Question now is, how did it come to this moment of unimaginable force? By the summer of 1945, the world was nearing exhaustion. 6 years of war had reshaped continents, erased cities, and ended empires in Europe. Adolf Hitler was dead, Berlin lay in ruins, and Germany had surrendered unconditionally in May. Yet across the Pacific, the Empire of Japan continued to fight with a fanaticism that defied the odds. For the United States, the war against Japan had been long, brutal, and costly. From the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, every island had been purchased with American blood. Casualty reports painted a grim picture. Tens of thousands of American dead, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers killed, and civilians caught between annihilation and surrender. Each new battle grew bloodier than the last. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman and his military advisors faced a dire calculation: an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Codenamed Operation Downfall was projected to cost more than 1 million American lives. Japanese defenses were thick with tunnels, caves, and artillery positions. Intelligence showed civilians training with bamboo spears and old rifles for a final suicidal stand. The lessons of Okinawa, where more than 200,000 people had perished in less than 3 months, loomed heavily over every map in the Pentagon. It was in this crucible of desperation that a secret project hidden from nearly all eyes promised an end to the war unlike any before known only to a few, as the Manhattan Project. It had consumed nearly 3 years, $2 billion, and the efforts of over 130,000 scientists, engineers, and soldiers in the deserts of New Mexico. On July 16, 1945, a blinding flash turned night into day, the first successful detonation of an atomic bomb. Witnesses described the fireball as a sun rising from the earth. The weapon had proven real. President Truman, at that moment attending the Potsdam Conference with Allied leaders, received the coded message: the baby is born. Within days, the conversation among the Allies shifted from if to when and where this new force would be. U.S. had the Potsdam Declaration, issued on July 26, demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction if it refused. Yet in Tokyo, the Supreme War Council split between peace advocates and hardline militarists. Remained paralyzed. Some argued for surrender if the emperor's position could be preserved. Others demanded one last battle to inflict such losses on the Americans that Japan might negotiate on better terms. Japanese government chose silence. The official response, makasatsu, literally meant to kill with silence. It was a fatal miscalculation. Truman and his advisors interpreted it as defiance. Meanwhile, us military planners under General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer compiled a short list of potential atomic targets. Each was selected for its military significance and lack of prior devastation to clearly measure the bomb's effect. Kyoto, Kakura, Nagata, and Hiroshima. Kyoto, with its deep cultural value, was spared on Secretary of War Henry Stinson's insistence. Hiroshima, however, remained an untouched industrial city with a population of over 300,000 and a concentration of military facilities including the headquarters of the 2nd General Army. By late July, preparations accelerated on the island of Tinian in the Marianas. Crews of the 509th Composite Group, led by Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, trained in secrecy for an unspecified special mission. Few among them knew the true nature of the weapon they were about to deliver. As August began, Japan faced total collapse, its navy destroyed, its air force crippled, its cities burned. But no one in Hiroshima nor in Tokyo could imagine the kind of weapon that now waited in the bomb bay of a single silver aircraft. Decision had been made. The date was set. The weapon was ready soon. The target city, quiet, orderly, and unscarred by firebombing, would become the testing ground for humanity's most devastating invention. And as the sun rose over Japan's southern coast, a new chapter of warfare prepared to begin. In 1945, Hiroshima was not the ruined name it would soon become. It was a thriving military and industrial hub of southern Japan. The city stretched along the delta of the Oda River, a landscape of bridges and small islands that gave it both beauty and vulnerability. With a population of roughly 340,000, it was home to soldiers, students, factory workers, and families who had endured years of rationing and air raid drills but had been spared the firestorms that consumed Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama. That absence of destruction was no accident. The US Army Air Forces had intentionally left Hiroshima untouched. Analysts wanted a clear target, one that could display the bomb's effects without interference from previous damage. Its concentration of military headquarters, supply depots, and factories made it ideal. Hiroshima produced parts for aircraft, artillery, and naval ordnance. The 2nd General Army headquarters, responsible for the defense of all southern Japan, occupied the center of the city. Till the people of Hiroshima, however, the absence of air raids felt like deliverance. Rumors spread that the city was protected by divine favor or by secret political importance. Farmers arrived daily from nearby villages with food to sell. Children walked to school. Workers reported to factories that hummed beside the river. Few believed the war could reach them directly in Tinian Island, 1,500 miles away. That illusion was being quietly dismantled at Northfield. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets had named his B-29 Enola Gay after his mother. It was one of 15 aircraft modified under the top-secret Silverplate program to carry the atomic bomb. The crew, handpicked for precision and composure, had trained for months on long-range flights, high-altitude approaches, and quick getaways. Their orders came in code: deliver little boy a uranium-based weapon never before tested in combat. Device weighed nearly 9,700 pounds and measured over 10 feet long inside. It lay 141 pounds of uranium, 235 it was. A weapon that released its energy not through fire or explosives, but through the splitting of atoms, a chain reaction, capable of unleashing more power than 2,000 tons of tin. The days before the mission, weather over Japan had turned uncertain. Clouds and storms had canceled earlier plans. Each morning, reconnaissance aircraft flew to observe target conditions, radioing back coded messages. Looking good over Hiroshima. The evening of August 5, 1945, under a bright Pacific moon, Enola Gay rolled onto the runway at Tinian. Technicians loaded little boy into its bomb bay. With the precision of surgeons, the men worked in silence. The heat pressed down even after midnight, the engines rumbling like distant thunder. At 2:45 a.m., August 6. Enola Gay lifted into the dark sky, escorted by 2 observation planes. The great artiste and necessary evil, their route north toward Iwo Jima, then on to Japan. The bomb's internal circuits were armed mid-flight by Captain William Deke Parsons, missions ordnance expert, who worked methodically under dim red lights far below in Hiroshima. The morning unfolded with deceptive calm. The city's air raid alert briefly sounded after a single aircraft, a US weather plane, passed overhead, but it was soon canceled. People returned to their routines. Doctors opened clinics. Soldiers drilled on the parade ground. Trams carried workers toward the industrial district. At 7:09 a.m., the Enola Gay crossed the Japanese coastline. Inside the cabin, Tibbets and Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee prepared for the bombing run. Their altimeter read 31,000 feet. The bomb release sequence would last only seconds. The escape plan required a 155-degree diving turn at full throttle to flee the blast. Hiroshima appeared below as a quiet tapestry of rooftops, rivers, and green parks. The aiming point was the Eyewitness Bridge, a shaped landmark, easily recognizable from the air. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. A single metallic object dropped silently toward the Earth. 43 seconds later, the world's first atomic weapon detonated, 1,900 feet above the city. For the next 10 minutes, communication with Hiroshima ceased. The quiet, prosperous city that had escaped fire for 4 years had vanished into a rising column of flame and ascended as the mushroom cloud bloomed into the stratosphere. Japan and the world entered an age it could never leave behind. The human angle. The city before the flashback. For 8:15 a.m. on August 6, Hiroshima was alive with human rhythm, the clatter of bicycles, the hum of sewing machines, the chatter of schoolchildren. Few understood how close the war was to ending, or how close their city stood to extinction. In the final months of the war, Hiroshima had become a place of contradiction, both a garrison town and a sanctuary. Thousands of evacuees from bombed-out cities had fled there, believing it to be safe. Young girls, some barely 14, were mobilized as student laborers, removing debris, helping in munitions factories, or organizing supplies for the army. Hospitals were full but not overwhelmed. Physicians still worked with some sense of order. The city's population had quietly adjusted to scarcity. Meals were thin rice mixed with barley, vegetables grown in small gardens, fish caught from the river when possible. Yet daily life endured. Parents sent their children to school, believing they would return for lunch. Many survivors later recalled the morning's strange clarity, the blue of the sky, the heat of the early sun. It was a world unprepared for what waited above the clouds. In seconds, the familiar landscape of wood and paper tile and bamboo would be consumed in a heat unlike anything human hands had ever created. That morning, the people of Hiroshima lived their last ordinary minutes, unaware that history itself was aligning its crosshairs on their city. Tactical angle. America's final calculation. For the American High Command, the atomic strike was not an act of impulse. It was the final measure in a long chain of strategic choices forged in exhaustion and necessity. By mid-1945, the U.S. military faced the brutal arithmetic of invasion. The planned assault on Kyushu, scheduled for November, projected American casualties exceeding 250,000. In the first months alone, Japanese civilian resistance and kamikaze tactics promised slaughter on a scale unseen. Even in Europe, the atomic bomb in this calculus offered a way to end the war without invading. A single blow powerful enough to force surrender and save lives on both sides. General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, and General Carl Spaatz of the U.S. Army Air Forces shaped the operational plan. They wanted the weapon used as soon as possible, under clear weather, on a target of unquestionable military value. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, conscious of moral precedent, insisted that civilian destruction be weighed against necessity. But in practice, the bomb's nature made that distinction impossible. Present Truman's orders were clear: use the weapon to bring Japan to unconditional surrender. In encoding his diary, he wrote simply, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It may shorten the agony of war. The tactical advantage was decisive. Japan's cities had already been crippled by months of firebombing. Its navy lay at the bottom of the sea. Its airfields were empty, but the Japanese government refused to yield. Intelligence intercepts revealed plans for a mass mobilization of civilians, an entire nation preparing to die rather than submit. Against that backdrop, the atomic bomb appeared as the final brutal answer, a weapon that could demonstrate such overwhelming force that surrender would no longer be a choice, but an inevitability. Tactical mission was precise, mechanical, and emotionless. 12 men, 1 aircraft, a single target. The decision behind it carried the weight of every soldier. Already buried in the Pacific, technological angle, the science of the unimaginable. Atomic bomb was unlike any weapon the world had ever conceived. It was not powered by fire, fuel, or pressure, but by the hidden energy locked inside the nucleus of the atom. Little boy, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was a gun-type uranium weapon. Its mechanism was brutally simple. Two subcritical masses of uranium-235 were slammed together by conventional explosives, forming a supercritical mass in a fraction of a second. The result was a runaway nuclear chain reaction releasing energy equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of ton. Scientists at Los Alamos had designed it without ever testing it. The plutonium-based bomb tested in New Mexico, the Trinity device, had proven the concept of nuclear detonation, but little boy relied on a different, theoretically simpler design that left no room for trial and error. Inside the bomb bay of Enola Gay, it rested, suspended by steel hooks, its casing painted dull olive. The crew had been briefed in technical fragments: altitude of release, flight path, and escape maneuver. None were told of the true nature of the chain reaction that would follow at detonation. The bomb's uranium core reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun in 1/1,000,000th of a second. Atoms split, energy multiplied exponentially, and a sphere of fire expanded outward at the speed of shock. Wave vaporized everything within half a mile, flattened nearly all structures within 2 miles, and ignited fires that merged into a citywide inferno. Even buildings designed of reinforced concrete crumbled from heat and pressure. It was not just a weapon, it was a transformation of nature itself into war. Humanity had discovered how to release the same energy that fuels stars, and it had chosen to test it over a city of civilians and soldiers. Alakined, as the light faded into ash, the true human, political, and moral dimensions of that technology began to unfold. The leadership angled decisions in silence. In July 1945, President Harry S. Truman inherited not only the presidency, but the burden of ending the most destructive war in human history. The death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in April had left him with little preparation for the atomic project he was about to unleash. Within weeks of taking office, he was briefed by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson and General Leslie Groves on the existence of a weapon of almost inconceivable power. Truman's military advisors believed that Japan's unconditional surrender could not be achieved through conventional means without catastrophic losses. Operation Downfall projected casualties so high that public support might fracture. In his diary, Truman wrote on July 25, "This weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. The target will be purely military, but purely military would prove an impossible boundary." Stimson, a man of conscience and restraint, struggled deeply with the implications. He argued for sparing Kyoto because of its cultural and spiritual significance, but he also believed that ending the war swiftly could save millions of Japanese lives that would otherwise be lost in invasion and starvation in Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito faced a different kind of paralysis. His ministers were divided, some advocating peace through negotiation, others urging one last stand to preserve Japan's honor. General Anami Karichika, Minister of War, declared that surrender was worse than annihilation. Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro hesitated, trapped between loyalty to the throne and fear of military revolt. Emperor listened in silence. He understood what his generals refused to see, that Japan's defeat was inevitable, yet no imperial decree had been issued. No formal decision to surrender had been made in that void of indecision. The bombers were already on their way. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, leadership on both sides ceased to matter for a moment. History's course was no longer guided by men, but by the blinding chain reaction unleashed from the sky. The enemy reaction, angle, shock, and disbelief. In Tokyo, word of Hiroshima's destruction arrived slowly, fragmented and unbelievable. The initial reports from military communications described a total loss of contact, no transmissions from Hiroshima since 0815 hours. Commanders assumed a conventional bombing raid had struck the city, but reconnaissance aircraft dispatched to investigate found something else: an entire city swallowed by a mushroom-shaped column of smoke stretching miles into the sky. Japanese General Staff received the first concrete information by midday on August 7th. The pilot of the reconnaissance plane circling at a distance had radioed back, "No Hiroshima exists." It was a phrase that defied comprehension at first. Military scientists speculated about a new kind of incendiary weapon or a magnesium bomb. The concept of a single explosive destroying an entire city seemed absurd. Only after the United States publicly announced the use of an atomic bomb did the truth begin to sink in the underground shelters of Tokyo's imperial headquarters. Silence followed the announcement. Officers studied aerial photographs showing nothing but a gray scar where Hiroshima had stood. Estimates of casualties reached 80,000 within hours, then continued to rise. Survivors' reports filtered in by rail and messenger. People turned to shadows against walls, burns that defied healing, rivers choked with corpses. Military doctors described radiation sickness without yet understanding its cause for those who had sworn to die for the emperor. The scale of this destruction was beyond even their concept of sacrifice. General Anami, still defiant, told the emperor that Japan could fight on, but others, including Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori, argued that no defense could counter a weapon of such magnitude. The Japanese leadership stood on the edge of collective disbelief, paralyzed between horror and pride. While they debated, a second bomb was being readied. Ontinian proof that Hiroshima had not been an isolated act of wrath, but a prelude moral angle, the weight of the decision in the corridors of power where the bomb had been conceived. A different reckoning began. The scientists of the Manhattan Project, who had worked in secrecy for years, faced the reality of their creation. Physicist Leo Szilard, who had first proposed the idea of a nuclear chain reaction in 1933, circulated a petition to warn against using the bomb without demonstration. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist who had fled Nazi occupation, urged for transparency and international control. Their voices were heard, but too late for many. Military leaders' morality and strategy could not coexist in wartime. General Groves later stated bluntly, "The mission was to end the war. We were not interested in the moral debate." President Truman defended the decision throughout his life, insisting that the bomb had saved countless lives by preventing invasion. Yet, in the ruins of Hiroshima, morality could no longer be theoretical. Charred bodies lay on bridges and riverbanks. Mothers searched for children who had simply ceased to exist. Hospitals burned with the wounded inside. Radiation, a force invisible, odorless, and merciless, continued to kill for months after the explosion. The moral question would never be settled. Could one atrocity justify the prevention of another? Could the annihilation of a city be weighed against the ending of a global war? Historians and theologians, soldiers and survivors, would wrestle with those questions for decades. What was certain was that August 6, 1945 had redrawn the boundaries of human warfare. No nation could now claim innocence from the shadow of the atomic morning after Hiroshima's destruction. The world awoke to a new moral era, one where humanity had gained the power to end itself. From that moment forward, both leadership and conscience faced the same unanswerable question. If such power could be created, who among men could ever again be trusted to control it? The flight of the Enola Gay was 2:45 a.m. August 6, 1945, on the tiny Pacific island of Tinian, under floodlights that cast long pale shadows across the tarmac. Ground crews moved with mechanical precision in the humid stillness of the night. The roar of the B-29 Superfortress engines broke the silence on its silver fuselage. A name had been freshly painted, Enola Gay, after the pilot's mother. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, 30 years old, stood at the base of the aircraft, his hands steady, but his thoughts heavy. The weapon loaded in the bomb bay was unlike any ever used in war. Its code name was Little Boy, a 10-foot 9700-pound uranium bomb designed to release the energy of 15,000 tons of TNT in a single flash. A few hours earlier, in a closed briefing room, Tibbets had told his men only what they needed to know. Navigator Theodore Van Kirk, bombardier Thomas Farabee, and radar operator Jacob Beezer understood that their mission could alter history. Few grasped the scale of what they carried. At 258 and the Enola Gay lifted off from the runway, followed closely by two other B-29s, the great artiste carrying instruments and necessary Able carrying cameras. Their destination, Hiroshima, a city of 35,000 people, a hub for military logistics, and according to planners an untouched canvas to measure the bomb's full impact. Approach to Hiroshima flight was long and uneventful over the Pacific. The stars shimmered above an endless black sea. As dawn approached, the crew switched to oxygen masks and climbed to 31,000 feet at 7:09 a.m. The weather plane straight flush sent back a coded message. Cloud cover less than 3/10. Target is clear below. Hiroshima was already awake. Workers streamed toward the Mitsubishi Steel Works. Children gathered for morning exercises in schoolyards, and trams clattered through the city streets. The air was still hot and heavy. A typical August morning. At 7:31 a.m. radar detected the Enola Gay approaching from the south. No air raid alarms were sounded. Japanese observers believed it to be a solitary reconnaissance plane, not worth the fuel to scramble. Fighters inside the cockpit Farabee began calibrating the Norden bomb sight. The crosshairs were set on the Ioi Bridge, the city's distinctive shaped structure that served as the aiming point. Tibbets gave the order. Bomb bay doors opened. Release at 8:15 a.m. Over the center of Hiroshima, the bomb dropped. The Enola Gay lurched upward as nearly 5 tons of uranium fell away. Tibbets turned sharply to the right and began the escape maneuver, a 155-degree dive designed to carry the aircraft away from the blast zone as fast as possible. Little boy fell for 43 seconds at 1,900 feet above the ground. A small radar altimeter triggered the detonation sequence sign. The next microsecond, uranium atoms split in a chain reaction that released energy equivalent to 15 kilotons of TNT. The temperature at the center of the explosion exceeded 4,000 C, 7,200 F, hotter than the surface of the Suna sphere of fire, 300 meters wide. Erupted, instantly expanding at the speed of sound within seconds. The blast wave flattened everything within a 2-kilometer radius. People near the hypocenter simply vanished. Their bodies vaporized, their shadows burned into the stone behind them. The firestorm within minutes. The heart of Hiroshima was a sea of fire. Winds of 1,000 kilometers per hour ripped through the streets, feeding the inferno. Wooden homes, paper walls, and tatami mats ignited like tinder. Survivors stumbled through the ruins, their skin hanging in ribbons, eyes blinded, voices gone. Hospitals collapsed, trams melted. The Oda River boiled. An estimated 70,000 people died in the first seconds. Tens of thousands more would perish from burns and radiation in the days that followed. At 31,000 feet, the crew of the Enola Gay watched in stunned silence. The shockwave struck the plane 43 seconds after detonation, a violent double thump that rattled the metal skin. The mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet into the air, glowing red and black, crowned with lightning. Co-pilot Robert Lewis, unable to contain himself, scribbled a single line into his logbook. "My God, what have we done?" After the blast in Tokyo, the first reports were dismissed as exaggerations. No one believed a single bomb could destroy an entire city. But by the time reconnaissance photographs reached Imperial headquarters, disbelief gave way to horror. The images showed a perfect circle of ash where Hiroshima had stewed. Messages from survivors spoke of a new kind of bomb. A doctor in the ruins described the sickening mystery of radiation patients without burns dying days later, bleeding from gums and eyes, their hair falling out in clumps. The Japanese government issued no immediate response. Emperor Hirohito's ministers debated, some convinced the Americans could not possibly have more than one of these weapons. They were wrong. 3 days later, a second B-29 boxcar would take off toward Nagasaki. The detonation over Hiroshima marked the beginning of a new age, an era where a single aircraft could decide the fate of an entire city. But the world had not yet seen the full measure of atomic horror. The second mission in the wake of Hiroshima's destruction, the world still struggled to comprehend what had happened. The Japanese government, though shaken, refused to surrender, Some generals insisted the Americans had used a novel type of incendiary bomb, not a weapon that could be repeated. Others clung to the hope that diplomacy through the Soviet Union might yet preserve the empire. But, in Washington, the orders had already been issued. If Japan did not surrender, a second atomic bomb would be used without delay on the island of Tinian. Engineers were already preparing the next weapon. This one was called Fat Man, a heavier, more complex plutonium implosion device, the same design tested in the New Mexico desert 3 weeks earlier. Unlike Little Boy, which used simple uranium fission, Fat Man's design required a network of precise detonators and perfect symmetry to trigger its immense reaction. Its target was initially Kokura, home to one of Japan's largest arsenals, but fate in a bank of clouds would change history's course. August 9, 1945, Nagasaki, at 3:47 a.m. Boxcar, another B-29 superfortress roared down the Tinian runway, piloted by Major Charles W. Sweeney. The aircraft carried a crew of 13 men and a bomb unlike any weapon the world had seen before. The weather reports were uncertain. Typhoon winds swept across Kyushu. Still, the orders were clear: if visibility over Kokura was poor, proceed to the secondary target. Nagasaki at 9:44 a.m. Boxcar reached Kokura. The city was blanketed in smoke from a previous air raid. Sweeney made 3 passes, but each time clouds obscured the aiming point. Fuel was running low. On the 3rd attempt, anti-aircraft fire began to rise from below. Reluctantly, he turned southwest toward Nagasaki. At 10:58 a.m., the bombardier found a break in the clouds. Below lay the Urakami Valley, a densely populated district surrounded by hills. Factories, shipyards, and schools filled the basin. Sweeney gave the order. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened, and Fat Man dropped the second atomic flash. The bomb exploded 1,650 feet above Nagasaki with a force of 21 kilotons of TNT, even more powerful than the one that had destroyed Hiroshima. The shockwave tore through the city in concentric circles. Entire neighborhoods vanished. The Urakami Cathedral, once the largest Christian church in Asia, disintegrated in an instant. Tens of thousands were killed outright, many vaporized, others crushed beneath collapsing buildings. The blast wave rolled through the narrow valley, bouncing between hills and amplifying its destruction. The sky over Nagasaki darkened as ash and dust climbed miles into the air. Rain began to fall, black and oily, thick with radioactive soot. Survivors would later call it Kuro, the Black Rain. Hospitals were gone, bridges had melted. People wandered in silence through the ruins, their skin burned and blistered the city around them. Unrecognizable toes. Realization. Within hours, the Japanese imperial staff received the first fragmentary reports. An entire city gone again, not by bombing raids, not by firestorms, but by a single weapon. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo told the Supreme War Council, "The enemy has a weapon beyond imagination. To continue fighting means the extinction of our nation." Even the most hardened militarists began to waver. General Anami Kurekaka, once determined to resist, now faced the reality that Japan's air defense was powerless, its army scattered, and its cities undefended. The Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan on August 8 sealed the final blow. There would be no negotiation, no mediation, no escape. For the first time, Emperor Hirohito broke his silence. In a calm, deliberate voice, he told his ministers that Japan must endure the unendurable. The empire could not survive another atomic attack. Inside the bombing shadow, at Ground Zero in Nagasaki, rescue efforts unfolded amid devastation beyond words. Doctors treated wounds with burnt hands, using boiled rags and scraps of paper as bandages. Priests and nurses moved among the dying, offering last rites in whispers, drowned by the crackle of distant fires. One survivor, Takashi Nagai, a radiologist, emerged from the ruins of the medical school. Burned and half-blinded, he looked upon the flattened city and wrote in his notebook, "We are beneath a sky that has fallen. This is not war, it is the end of the world." Both Hiroshima and Nagasaki radiation sickness began its silent work. Within days, people who had seemed unharmed collapsed from fever, and internal bleeding. Hair fell out, gums bled, and skin turned purple. No one yet understood the invisible poison that lingered in the dust and the rain. Final message. On August 10th, the Japanese government sent an urgent cable through neutral Switzerland, offering to surrender with one condition: the emperor's position must be preserved in Washington. President Harry S. Truman and his advisors accepted. The new weapon had achieved what years of bloody island warfare could not. 5 days after Hiroshima, and just 1 day after Nagasaki, Japan's will to fight had broken as the mushroom cloud over Nagasaki drifted away into the stratosphere. It carried with it more than smoke and ash. It carried the end of an era and the beginning of the atomic age. While the world celebrated the end of the war, Japan was only beginning to reckon with the depth of its horror. The silence after the storm, when the smoke cleared over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the scale of destruction defied imagination. From the air, reconnaissance planes photographed a gray void where two vibrant cities had once stood. Nothing moved. No roofs, no roads, no walls remained. In some areas, the ground shimmered like glass sand fused by heat. For days, Japanese officials refused to believe the reports. Even those who visited the ruins struggled to comprehend what they saw. A military survey team sent to Hiroshima found no recognizable landmarks. The coordinates of the city center were marked by a twisted bridge and a circle of blackened debris stretching for miles. At ground level, the survivors, the hibakusha, wandered through a world of ash. Many were too weak to cry. Others lay along the riverbanks whispering for water. A week later, entire families still searched for missing loved ones, only to find nothing but the shadows burned into stone. The emperor's decision on August 14th, 1945. After days of intense debate within the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito made his final decision. In a small underground shelter surrounded by his closest advisors, he spoke with calm resignation. To continue the war would mean the total extinction of human civilization. That night, under heavy guard, technicians of the Imperial Household Agency made a secret recording of the emperor's voice, the first time most of his people would ever hear it. The acetate discs were hidden inside a box and smuggled past rebellious army officers who still hoped to stop the surrender. The next day, on August 15th, 1945 at noon, Japan's radio networks fell silent. Then came a soft, unfamiliar voice. The emperor announced that the war had ended. He did not say surrender, but the meaning was clear. In homes and temples across Japan, people wept. Some bowed toward the radio. Others simply stared at the floor in disbelief. The words, "We must endure the unendurable," became the nation's epitaph. The Allied reaction. In Washington, London, and Sydney, spontaneous celebrations erupted in the streets. In New York's Times Square, sailors kissed strangers. Bells rang across Paris. The war that had consumed 6 years across 3 continents was finally over. But inside the halls of power, the mood was more complicated. President Harry S. Truman, when informed of Japan's surrender, reportedly whispered, "This is the greatest thing in history." Yet even he understood what had been unleashed. The atomic bomb had not only ended the war, it had redefined what war meant. The U.S. had proven its technological supremacy beyond question. Factories in Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford had achieved the unthinkable, turning theoretical physics into the most destructive force ever known. The weapon was both victory and warning, symbol of power but also of peril. Across the Atlantic, Winston Churchill summarized the world's unease. This revelation of the secrets of nature should arouse the most solemn reflections in the mind and heart of every man. The first witnesses in September 1945. Allied occupation troops arrived in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What they found defied all briefings. American and British soldiers walked through a wasteland of skeletal buildings and scorched earth. The smell of burned wood and flesh still hung in the air. Military photographers filmed the ruins. Doctors examined survivors suffering from strange illnesses, nausea, fevers, bleeding gums, open sores that would not heal. They did not yet know the word radiation sickness. Journalist Wilfred Burchett, defying orders, reached Hiroshima and sent a dispatch titled The Atomic Plague. His words shocked the world. In Hiroshima, I write this as a warning to the world. The people are simply vaporized, carbonized, and then the living die slowly. The United States initially tried to control such reports, fearing the moral backlash. But soon the images of burned children, ruined hospitals, and endless funeral pyres reached global audiences. The atomic bomb was no longer a symbol of triumph. It had become a symbol of terror. From the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, humanity stood at a crossroads, victory on one side, annihilation on the other. And yet, even as Japan lay in ruins, the world's great powers began to ask a haunting question: what comes after the end of the war? The American occupation. When General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo on August 30th, 1945, Japan was no longer an empire, it was a nation in ruins. Cities lay flattened, millions were homeless, and food shortages threatened to claim more lives than the bombings themselves. Yet the arrival of American troops was not met with the expected resistance. There were no ambushes, no acts of defiance. Instead, the Japanese watched in stunned silence as the victors walked their streets, disciplined, calm. Almost gentle. MacArthur's mission was clear: to militarize Japan, rebuild its society, and ensure it would never again wage war. The U.S. occupation quickly became one of the most ambitious nation-rebuilding efforts in history. Weapons were confiscated. The samurai code of militarism was outlawed, and a new constitution was drafted, one that renounced war forever. In the ruins of Hiroshima, American scientists from the atomic bomb casualty commission began studying the survivors. They documented burns, cancer rates, and genetic damage, not yet fully understanding the long-term cost of radiation. To the Japanese, this clinical interest was a second wound, a reminder that even in peace, they had become subjects of a new kind of war, the war of science. The survivors' struggle. The Hiroshima survivors of the atomic bombings faced a lifetime of hardship. Many were ostracized, viewed as contaminated, or cursed. Radiation sickness left them weak and disfigured. Employers avoided them, and marriages were often denied for fear of hereditary illness. In Hiroshima, a young girl named Sadako Sasaki, who had been 2 years old during the bombing, fell ill with leukemia a decade later. As she lay in her hospital bed, she began folding paper cranes, believing the old legend that folding 1,000 would grant a wish. She reached 644 before she died. Her classmates finished the rest in her memory today. Her statue stands in Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park, holding a single paper crane, a symbol not of revenge, but of resilience. Around her, the names of more than 300,000 victims are etched into stone. The Japanese people, even amid loss, chose remembrance over hatred. Each August, as the bells toll at 8:15 m, Hiroshima falls silent. Survivors bow their heads, and for 1 minute, the entire city listens to the sound of peace. The world awakens. While Japan rebuilt, the rest of the world entered a new, uneasy era. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly. Within years, both nations possessed hydrogen bombs, weapons 1,000 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan. Same scientific genius that had once promised victory now threatened mutual extinction. A shadow fell over the post-war decades, a balance of terror known as the Cold War. Civil defense drills, fallout shelters, and sirens became part of daily life from New York to Moscow. And yet amid this fear, Hiroshima became something else, a mirror held up to humanity. The city rebuilt itself not as a monument to destruction, but as a beacon of peace. Scientists, poets, and leaders from around the world visited its memorials. The ruins of the Genbaku Dome, left standing by design, became a United Nations World Heritage Site, preserved as a warning that progress without conscience leads only to ashes. A new Japan under American supervision. Japan transformed faster than anyone expected. Within 2 decades, its factories roared back to life. Cameras, radios, cars, and ships replaced tanks and rifles. A new generation, unscarred by war, grew up believing in peace, democracy, and progress. The Same nation that once unleashed the war in the Pacific became one of America's strongest allies and one of the world's leading voices for nuclear disarmament. For many Japanese, however, the lesson of Hiroshima was not about guilt or defeat. It was about survival, the quiet strength to rebuild a nation from nothing and to remind the world of what can never be. Repeated in 1945, the United States ended a world war with a single weapon, but in doing so it began a new kind of conflict, one fought not for land or empire, but for the future of mankind itself. In the long shadow of 1945, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as silent witnesses to the birth of a new world, one built on triumph and tragedy in equal measure. The atomic bomb ended the most devastating war in human history, but it also opened a door that could never again be closed for the United States. The weapon was proof of industrial and scientific mastery, the ultimate expression of a nation's resolve to end total war. Yet for Japan it marked the moment when the sky itself became a weapon and survival meant confronting the limits of human endurance. The two cities, once symbols of destruction, became testaments to renewal. Streets, once scorched by heat, now bloom with cherry trees. Children play where shadows were once burned into stone, and every year on August 6th and 9th the bells of remembrance echo through both cities, not in anger but in warning. Historians still debate whether the bombings were necessary. Strategists still argue whether they saved more lives than they took, but beyond those questions lies a truth that no calculation can erase. That in a single flash humanity glimpsed its own extinction and chose, at least for now, to turn away. The atomic age began not with a march or a victory parade, but with silence, the silence of a city erased, and the silence of those who understood that the same power that ended one war could one day end all wars. And so Hiroshima endures not merely as a memory of what was lost, but as a living reminder of what must never happen again.